Brothers and sisters, we must unite for our future. Together we will triumph.
In 1973, Mobutu Sese Seko stood in front of his nation and announced a revolution. Zaire's economy, he declared, would finally belong to Zaireans. Foreign-owned businesses, farms, factories, shops, plantations would be seized and handed to the people. The crowds cheered. The state radio called it liberation. It was, in fact, the single largest theft in the history of Central Africa. And Mobutu Sese Seko wasn't giving anything to his people. He was giving it to himself. Within 3 years, the policy he called Zaireanization would gut an entire national economy, hand billions of dollars of productive assets to a small circle of loyalists who understood nothing about running them, and quietly funnel a fortune into Swiss vaults under names that trace back to one man. By the time the dust settled, Zaire, a country richer in copper, cobalt, and diamonds than almost anywhere on earth, was functionally bankrupt. This is how a dictator built a personal fortune estimated at over $4 billion, using a policy he sold to his own people as their liberation. To understand how audacious this theft really was, you need to understand what Mobutu inherited. The Congo, renamed Zaire in 1971, sat on some of the richest mineral deposits on the planet. Copper in Katanga, cobalt reserves so vast the country supplied a majority of the world's global output. Diamonds, gold, timber. Rubber plantations built during the brutal Belgian colonial era were still in the early 1970s, largely foreign-owned, run by Belgian, Greek, Portuguese, and Pakistani businessmen who had stayed on after independence in 1960. For a young nation still scarred by the assassination of Patrice Lumumba and years of civil war, foreign ownership of the economy was a genuinely sore wound. Colonial extraction hadn't ended with independence. It had just changed its paperwork. Mobutu understood this resentment intimately, and he understood that resentment could be weaponized. In November 1973, he gave a speech announcing what would become known as Zaireanization. Foreign-owned businesses below a certain size, farms, plantations, retail shops, small factories, would be nationalized and transferred to Zairean citizens. On paper, it was economic justice. In practice, it became something closer to a lottery rigged entirely in favor of one address, the presidential palace. Because the businesses weren't handed to farmers, workers, or entrepreneurs. They were handed to Mobutu's family, his political allies, his military officers, and his personal friends, a class that would come to be known, bitterly, as the acquireurs, the acquirers. The genius of Zaireanization, and genius is the right word, however monstrous the outcome, was that it never looked like theft from the outside. It looked like policy. Here's how it actually worked. A government commission would identify a foreign-owned enterprise, say, a plantation growing palm oil in Equateur province, or a retail chain in Kinshasa. The foreign owner would receive notice that the business was being transferred to Zairean ownership, effective immediately, often with little or no compensation. The business, its inventory, its equipment, its trucks, its bank accounts, all of it, would then be assigned to a new owner, selected not through any competitive or merit-based process, but through direct patronage from the presidential circle. Mobutu's brothers received businesses. His sons received businesses. Regional governors, military commanders, and loyal party officials received businesses. Some acquireurs ended up owning 3, 4, 5 enterprises simultaneously, plantations they had never visited, factories whose machinery they didn't understand, retail operations they had no intention of actually managing. And that was precisely the second phase of the collapse. Most of the new owners had no experience running these enterprises. Many treated their new acquisitions not as businesses to be operated, but as assets to be stripped. Equipment was sold off. Inventory was liquidated. Workers went unpaid. Within 18 months of the policy's implementation, a significant share of Zaireanized businesses had ground to a halt entirely. Output collapsing, employees abandoned, supply chains that had taken decades to build simply evaporating. Zaire's economy didn't just lose its foreign owners, it lost the functioning businesses themselves. By 1975, the damage was undeniable even to Mobutu. Agricultural output, particularly in export crops like palm oil and rubber, had cratered. Retail shortages hit Kinshasa and other cities. The very people Zaireanization had supposedly been designed to help were now facing empty shelves and rising prices. Mobutu announced a partial reversal, called radicalization, then later further adjustments allowing some original foreign owners to buy back stakes in their former businesses, for a price, and often with a Zairean partner from the Akeria class still attached, still skimming a cut. It was less a correction of the original theft than a second monetization of it. Having taken the businesses once, the regime now charged to give partial control back. But here's the detail that matters most, the one that separates Mobutu from merely being an incompetent economic reformer. The money that had already moved during the initial wave of Zaireanization didn't stay in Zaire waiting to be sorted out. It had already started leaving the country. This is the part of the story that turns economic mismanagement into something closer to a heist film. Because Mobutu wasn't simply an inept administrator who watched his economic policy backfire. Parallel to the public collapse of Zaireanized businesses, a private financial architecture was being built, one designed specifically to move wealth out of Zaire and into personal accounts controlled by Mobutu, his family and his closest circle. Zaire's state mining company, Gécamines, the entity controlling the nation's staggering copper and cobalt wealth, became one of the central arteries. Export revenues that should have flowed into national reserves were instead diverted through a web of transactions, middlemen contracts, and inflated invoicing schemes. Money that copper and cobalt sales generated on international markets took detours before reaching the state treasury. Detours that consistently ended in personal accounts rather than public ones. Swiss banks, with their tradition of numbered accounts and financial secrecy, became the preferred destination. Estimates from journalists, historians, and international financial investigators over subsequent decades place Mobutu's personal fortune at its peak, somewhere between $4 and $5 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum for a nation whose ordinary citizens were, by the 1980s, facing hyperinflation, collapsing infrastructure, and public salaries that arrived months late, if they arrived at all. That fortune didn't just sit in bank vaults. It became castles in Spain, a chateau in the French region of Yvelines, custom-fitted with a private airstrip capable of landing a Concorde jet, because Mobutu, on more than one occasion, chartered the supersonic aircraft for personal shopping trips to Paris. Villas on the French Riviera, property portfolios spread across Belgium, Switzerland and Italy, a lifestyle built entirely from wealth extracted from a nation where the average citizen would never see running water reach their home. None of this could have functioned without complicity. And here the story stops being purely about one man's greed and becomes about the geopolitical machine that enabled it. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, Mobutu remained one of the United States' most valuable Cold War allies in Central Africa, a bulwark, in Washington's eyes, against Soviet and Cuban-backed movements in neighboring Angola. That strategic value bought him something more valuable than any single payment. It bought him silence. American administrations from Nixon through Reagan continued military and economic support to Zaire, largely looking past the well-documented corruption, because the alternative, a Zaire vulnerable to Soviet-aligned influence, was considered the greater risk. International financial institutions extended loans to Zaire that, by the analysis of numerous later economic reviews, financed as much personal enrichment as they did national development. Swiss banking secrecy laws, at the time among the strictest in the world, meant that even when journalists and investigators suspected exactly where Zaire's missing billions had landed, proving it and moving to seize it was, for decades, close to legally impossible. The theft wasn't hidden through brilliance alone. It was hidden through a system of Cold War convenience, banking secrecy, and international indifference that made looking away the path of least resistance for almost everyone with the power to intervene. By the time Mobutu was finally overthrown in 1997, dying in exile in Morocco months later, reportedly of cancer, his fortune scattered across accounts and properties that would take investigators years to even partially trace, Zaire itself had become a case study in what economists call a kleptocracy, a state where the machinery of governance exists primarily to funnel wealth to those already in power. The nation he left behind, renamed the Democratic Republic of the Congo after his fall, inherited a debt burden built substantially from loans that had financed his personal empire rather than the country's development. Infrastructure that had existed at independence in 1960, railways, roads, hospitals, had, in many regions, actually deteriorated rather than improved over his 32 years in power, despite the nation's staggering natural mineral wealth. Some of the Swiss accounts were eventually frozen. Some properties were eventually identified. But the vast majority of what Mobutu extracted was never recovered, absorbed into a financial system built specifically to make recovery difficult, and further complicated by a country too devastated in the aftermath of his rule to mount the sustained legal campaign that reclaiming it would have required. Zaireanization was sold to the world, and to Zaireans themselves, as an act of liberation, a nation finally reclaiming its own economy from foreign hands. It was, underneath that language, one of the most efficient wealth extraction machines ever built by a single ruler. Not because Mobutu was uniquely brilliant at economics, his policy nearly destroyed the very economy he claimed to be liberating. He was uniquely brilliant at something else entirely, making theft look like justice, making a heist look like a policy, and making sure that by the time anyone understood what had actually happened, the money was already gone, already in Switzerland, already unreachable. The businesses he seized collapsed. The country he ruled crumbled. The vaults, for the most part, stayed full.